we're almost done here in our notes. We just have to talk about a couple more topics. They're sort of extra. They're still related to evolution. We talked about natural selection a lot. So today we're going to talk a little bit about artificial selection and sexual selection. So you learned about this in 7th grade. What is artificial selection? David?
When humans affect humans or another species choose which can survive and can't survive.
Yeah, basically. So in natural selection, there's some selective agent that is determining which individuals survive and reproduce. It could be the amount of food, it could be predators, and so forth. Artificial selection is when it's humans choosing which individuals survive and which don't, based on certain variations. Artificial selection can allow humans to basically shape a species to have specific characteristics that humans value. And so the examples of selective breeding or artificial selection are agricultural crops, domestic animals, pets. These are all the result of artificial selection by humans. And so we'll go over several examples of this. So the fruits and vegetables and grains that we eat all originated as a wild plant. And humans took these wild plants, and most of them are still around. We still have the wild plants, and scientists have figured out how we selectively bred our crops from these wild ancestor plants. But, for example, this is wild mustard. It's a common plant. Kind of just looks like a weed with little flowers. And so, yeah. And wild mustard is the ancestral plant that humans selectively bred to produce all of these other vegetables. So broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts. They all evolved from, or not evolved, they were all selectively bred by humans from this ancestral plant. And so by choosing the wild mustard individual plants that had larger leaves than others, and using those to pollinate another plant and grow the seeds and repeating that generation after generation led to the enlargement of the leaves of this plant until we end up with something like kale. So broccoli is bred from wild mustard where the flowers develop later and later. And so it stays in this form and we use that as broccoli. And so different characteristics were selected for to produce these different types of vegetables. Another example, and I have a video at the end of class, we'll watch some of it. Corn. So modern corn has been around for a long time. It was questionable. Scientists weren't really sure. They didn't find anything really in nature that was similar to corn. Okay? And they did eventually figure out that modern corn, or maize as it's also called, was selectively bred from teosinte, this other sort of grassy plant that has these really small fruits, okay, that look like this. But by humans selecting the teosinte plants that had the largest fruits, okay, or the fruits that had the most sugar or starch in them, and then breeding them together, over time the size of these fruits increased, okay, until they were bred into modern corn. It happens with animals as well. So humans, through selective breeding bred cows and pigs and chickens and dogs and cats and all of these other sort of domestic animals all have ancestors in the wild. Okay? All modern dogs, their common ancestor is a wolf. Okay? Dogs are bred by humans from wolves. And so, how would humans be able to breed dogs from sort of a pretty ferocious predator animal? Yeah?
They tame it, domesticate it.
How? But that's sort of what I'm asking.
They make it, they feed it.
Well, you can't just feed a wolf and turn it into a dog.
Well, you could.
David?
They took baby wolves or whatever, pups.
Wolf pups, yeah.
Wolf pups, and domesticated them before they became ferocious creatures.
But I'm asking, like, well, how do they domesticate?
Well,
Like,
then they-
even if you have a wolf pup, it doesn't. You can't just raise it into a dog.
No, well, you-
Mateo?
Make it.
They bred the calmer,
It was a nice
the
place.
dogs together.
They weren't dogs.
They were not-
wolves. Yes.
My bad.
Joe?
They bred the wolves with the desirable traits.
So what were the desirable traits?
Not nippy.
Fuzziness.
Calm,
Yeah.
less aggressive. So in the ancestral wolf population, there's probably some variability in how aggressive the animal is, right? And that perhaps there were some wolves that were not very aggressive. And if humans then allowed them to sort of stay around their encampments, obviously any aggressive wolf, humans are going to kill them or chase them away because they don't want them around. But if there were some that were less aggressive, maybe they let them sort of scavenge over the remains of whatever foods the humans were eating. And if they then bred, what would humans do with any aggressive wolf pups?
Throw them into the ocean.
Kill them, right? Or not keep them around. And so if you repeat this process and you constantly only allow the least aggressive of these animals around and you allow them to mate and reproduce, over many generations you end up with a more tame animal. And that's where domestic dogs, how they were selectively bred. Since then, humans have taken this sort of generic ancestor dog and bred them into all of the different breeds of dogs we have today. Now, a wolf and a dog are separate species, but different breeds of dogs are all single species. And so when you have domestic dogs, by choosing only the smallest of them and allowing them to mate, we can breed over time really, really small dogs. By only breeding the ones that are good swimmers, we can end up with breeds that swim well, or breeds that herd, or breeds that are protective. So the different breeds that we have today were selectively bred by choosing whatever traits were desirable and allowing them to breed, producing offspring that have those desirable traits. Dan?
What's that orange one? The big like.
Oh, what's that big puffy one called?
Chow.
Chow chow, yeah. All right. We'll watch this maybe later, these two videos, but let me just finish with this. So that's artificial selection. Another type of selection that's important in nature is sexual selection. Sexual selection is natural selection applied to sort of mating. And we see in many species, especially of animals, especially of vertebrates, this sexual dimorphism. What that means is there are distinct differences in appearance and sometimes behavior between the males and females of a species. Here are some examples, and you're probably familiar with some of these. Birds often show pretty distinct sexual dimorphism. Like if you see in your backyard at a bird feeder a cardinal. What's a cardinal look like?
Red.
Red.
Those
They
are
must
only
be brown,
males. Those are only male cardinals. Female cardinals are the same basic body shape, same thick beak, same little crest on the top of their head, but they're not bright red.
They're brown.
They're brownish gray with like some red tones to them. Birds show this oftentimes. Here's a wren, the male on the left. This is the female. It's the same species, but there's very distinct differences between males and females. Ducks show this as well, mallard ducks
That looks like
and
a
wood
fake-
ducks and so forth. Peacocks is a great example. So the peacock, this is the male. So only, when you imagine a peacock, you're only thinking of the male peacock. They have the huge tail feathers. They have the showy blue crest. The female peacock just looks like, I don't know, kind of looks like a chicken sort of thing.
Peahen.
Yeah, it's called a peahen. They don't show those same characteristics. So this evolves when females often choose a mate based on this coloration or this large tail feathers or this mating behavior, these antlers. And this sort of might make sense because what does it mean if a buck has these elaborate, very large antlers? What does that mean about it? They don't really use them to defend themselves against predators.
It's an alpha.
What? That they're older, so each season those antlers become larger. So what does that tell them? They fight, who do they fight?
Other males.
Other males.
With them.
Right. So it's not so much about protection. So what if it means they're older, what is that signaling to the female?
Experience.
And survival, right? That they have been able to survive for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, meaning what about their,
Good genes.
yeah, that they probably have variations that are helpful, successful. It takes a lot of energy to grow larger antlers, okay? And therefore, that's a signal that that male is able to find enough food and so forth. So often females are choosing the males based on some of these patterns. Okay? Well then why do the females not have these characteristics?
Because they're the pickers.
They're the ones, yes, typically in these situations, it's the females that are choosing which males they're going to mate with. Okay? And the males are competing for those mates. Because are these antlers an advantage to anything other than reproduction?
No.
No, they're probably a disadvantage. Right? It's more difficult to move through the forest if you have a huge antler. If you have these huge peacock feathers, you stand out more. You're probably more vulnerable to predators. So there's this sort of trade-off. It might allow those organisms to mate more successfully, but they could also reduce their likelihood of survival, and so it's this balance. So often the females, if they're not competing for mates, then they often are sort of a dull color, or they blend in better, or they're smaller, because that's the advantage for females. All right. So we've seen several examples of these sort of, you might call them like a family tree of an organism. They're not really a family tree. They are called phylogenetic trees. They sort of trace the ancestry of certain species back through time. Okay? And so that science is called phylogeny. And originally scientists sort of could create these diagrams showing the history of a species based on the appearance of the organisms, based on certain traits they can measure and observe. Now today we have a much more reliable way of doing that. And what do you think it is? DNA. So DNA evidence allows us to create these phylogenetic trees with good accuracy. They're called cladograms. And they show us how species are evolved. So for example, if you imagine 300 years ago before we had any DNA evidence, most people would probably say, well, probably a fungus like a mushroom, probably closely related to a plant, right? They both kind of grow out of the ground, they don't move, they don't seem to really eat anything. That might make sense. However, when we look at the DNA of these organisms, it actually turns out that fungi are more closely related to humans than they are to plants. Okay? We could see that in their DNA. Because as time goes on, once a species, after speciation, a single population splits into two species, what starts to happen to those two species? Over time, they change, they start to become different from each other. What happens to their genes?
They become better.
Well, they become different from each other, right? They're each taking a different path. Over time, mutations build up in these species. And so we can kind of use these differences as a plot. If I compare, for example, wolves and domestic dogs, I'll find their DNA very, very similar, which tells us it hasn't been that long since they were one species. There hasn't been much time before they didn't have much chance for differences to occur. So we know they had a common ancestor, maybe not too long ago. If we look at the DNA of a wolf and a panther, we're going to find a lot of differences. What that means is there's been a long period of time for these differences to build up, which means it was a long time ago, or longer time, when they shared a common ancestor. So they had all of this time, okay, to build up those differences. And we can use this information to build these cladograms, which show the relationship between species, shows when species had common ancestors, and sort of the pathway through which these species evolved from. Then our last piece of information talked about is sort of, okay, well, if we think about the Earth and the history of the Earth, how old is the Earth?
4.6 billion.
Yeah, 4.6 billion years old. It's about the age of our planet. For about 1 billion years, there was no life on Earth. Okay, well, the first life on Earth, the first evidence for it, doesn't appear until about 3.5 billion years ago. So the question science have always asked, well, where did these first cells, these first living organisms, how did they form? If we know there was no life on the very early Earth, how did they come about? How could they have evolved? And so scientists can basically they can understand what the Earth's early atmosphere was, what elements it was composed of, what molecules were probably in the oceans at that time. And when they do that, okay, they find that it's basically inorganic substances. Okay, there's water, there's nitrogen, there's inorganic, simpler compounds. So these two scientists in the 1950s did an experiment. Miller and Urey, 1952. What they did is they created this apparatus. In one of these vessels, they put what they think the ancient oceans probably were like. Okay, the inorganic materials that are present in the early ocean. In this vessel, they put a mixture of gases they think were what the Earth's early atmosphere was like. In the early Earth, there's a lot of lightning and electrical activity. So they added electrodes here that they can spark periodically. And they allowed this setup, I think maybe about a week or so, to sort of run for a week or so. And then they examined the chemicals that were there at the end. And what they found is that there were some very simple organic molecules had assembled from these inorganic materials. They actually found all 20 amino acids that are necessary in living things were in this apparatus here. And so scientists use that evidence to say that under these certain conditions that were present on the early Earth, you could get these organic substances from these simple inorganic substances. Okay? So that's sort of the beginning stages. You end up with water and carbon, and you add this electricity and end up with simple organic molecules. And then these simple organic molecules can combine to more complex molecules. And they can combine into nucleotides and RNA, and gradually over time, the components of life have assembled. The first life we have evidence for on Earth was bacteria. Bacteria-like organisms. Simple cells with DNA in them, but without any complex organelles. Okay, that was around 3.5 billion years ago. The early Earth did not contain oxygen. So scientists know that the first types of bacteria were anaerobic bacteria, bacteria that don't use oxygen. They have to use other means to get energy. That's called the heterotroph hypothesis, that the first organisms, the first bacteria were heterotrophs, not autotrophs. Eventually, photosynthetic bacteria evolved about 2.2 billion years ago. And as you know, what's one of the byproducts of photosynthesis? Oxygen. And so after these photosynthetic bacteria evolved, oxygen started to be released from the ocean, started to build up in the atmosphere. And that allowed organisms that use that oxygen to evolve, which we would call aerobic bacteria, that use oxygen for respiration. But all of these organisms were simple prokaryotes. The next question science asks, well, how did we get eukaryotic cells, cells that have organelles in them, are more complex? And so the endosymbiotic theory was that actually some of these simple prokaryotes started to live inside of other prokaryotes, form the symbiotic relationship. For example, photosynthetic bacteria evolved to live inside of these other cells. And what did those photosynthetic bacteria become inside of another cell? Can you imagine? Close.
Chloroplast.
They evolved to become chloroplasts. When you look inside of cells today, chloroplasts, they actually have their own DNA, different from the DNA of the nucleus. And that's one piece of evidence scientists use to understand that. Aerobic bacteria evolved in the same way. What did they become? They use oxygen to release energy.
Excretory system?
No?
Trees.
No.
Plants.
They are in a cell.
Oh, in the cell.
An aerobic
Mitochondria.
mitochondria. They evolved to be mitochondria. Mitochondria also has its own DNA different from the nucleus. From there, organisms that reproduce sexually evolved. Organisms evolved to become multicellular. Eventually, simple invertebrates like sponges and corals, things like that evolved. From there, plants evolved. Simple, low-growing plants. From invertebrates, vertebrates evolved. First, jawless fish, then fish with jaws, then amphibians. From amphibians, reptiles. From reptiles, birds and mammals evolved. Okay. Flowering plants evolved on land. So that's sort of the, oh, here's the diagram. This shows that endosymbiotic relationship where you have these aerobic bacteria and photosynthetic bacteria becoming an actual part of a simple eukaryotic cell. And over time, we ended up with the diversity of life that we see on Earth today. So we'll have to watch maybe on Monday the dog and corn video. Any questions about anything today? All right, we're done with our evolution notes.